The room smelled of expensive cigars, polished leather, and raw, suffocating fear. A man sat in silence behind a heavy mahogany desk, ruling an underworld built on absolute control. A ruthless mafia boss with sharp eyes and ink-stained skin, his stone-faced enforcers always watching beside him. He wasn't looking to show mercy to anyone. Then, right in the center of his private office, a woman appeared. She stood trembling, one hand clutching a worn leather bag to her chest, the other resting on her racing heart. Not a threat, just a soul with nowhere else to hide. She stopped a few steps away. Didn't beg, didn't hesitate. "I'll work for your organization," she said quietly. "Just let me stay." The man looked at her, his expression a mix of cold calculation and utter disbelief. For a moment, he raised a single finger to have his men throw her out. But the door clicked open, and a little girl's whisper changed everything. "Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If this story moves you in any way, consider subscribing and being part of this journey." The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the soundproofed office in a sudden, ringing quiet. With a sharp flick of his chin, Jimmy dismissed his towering enforcers, who vanished into the shadows of the corridor. Bertha remained glued to her father's side, her small hand tightly anchoring him to his humanity. Jimmy leaned forward across the mahogany desk, his wide, ink-etched stare drilling straight into Veronica. "Start talking," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And don't leave out a single word." Spurred by desperation, the words spilled from Veronica in a breathless rush. She detailed the chaotic afternoon weeks ago when a black SUV had opened fire on a crowded sidewalk, and how she had instinctively thrown her own body over a terrified little girl hidden behind a concrete planter. As Jimmy listened, his gaze shifted between the trembling woman and his daughter, who nodded solemnly in confirmation. The cold, unyielding armor around the mob boss cracked. A Falcone never ignored a blood debt. This woman had protected his entire world, and now the rules of the underworld demanded he return the favor. He slid his glass of bourbon aside and stood up, towering over the desk. "You have sanctuary," Jimmy declared, the finality in his tone absolute. "For now." He tossed a heavy brass key onto the polished wood. It belonged to the secluded, minimalist apartment directly above the pulsing base of the Onyx Lounge. But the mercy came with a razor-sharp edge. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her completely. "You stay upstairs. You do not wander, and you do not speak to anyone. If the cartel is hunting you, you stay out of sight. Break my rules, and the street gets you back." The four walls of the upstairs apartment quickly began to feel like a gilded cage. Days bled into one another, punctuated only by the muffled, rhythmic thumping of the bass from the nightclub below. Veronica was not a woman built for idle waiting. The silence in her head only invited the terrifying ghosts of the cartel to creep back in. Desperate for a distraction to anchor her racing mind, she ventured down the back iron stairwell during the club's daylight hours, finding the main office unlocked and deserted. On the desk sat stacked ledgers and open spreadsheets, the club's chaotic, dual-layered financial records. It was a mess of poorly laundered cash flows, amateur formatting, and glaring mathematical vulnerabilities that practically begged for an audit. Drawing on her years in corporate finance, Veronica sat in the leather chair, pulled the glowing monitor closer, and let her muscle memory take over. For hours, the only sound was the rapid, rhythmic clicking of the keyboard. She systematically untangled the messy web of shell companies, streamlined the revenue tracking, and plugged the financial leaks that had been draining thousands from the syndicate's legitimate fronts. The heavy office door suddenly creaked open. Veronica froze, her fingers hovering over the keys as Marco, Jimmy's imposing lead enforcer, stepped into the room. He stopped dead in his tracks, his hand instinctively drifting toward his jacket lining, his dark sunglasses hiding his eyes but not his lethal irritation. He marched over, casting a massive shadow across the desk as he peered down at the glowing monitor. Veronica held her breath, expecting to be thrown out, but Marco's rigid posture slowly eased. He stared at the flawlessly reorganized data, a rare, begrudging glimmer of respect cutting through his stone-faced demeanor. The office door remained slightly ajar, letting a sliver of warm light cut through the dim corridor of the closed nightclub. Jimmy paused in the hallway, his hand hovering inches from the brass handle as a soft sound caught his attention. Inside, Veronica was sitting on the leather sofa, a heavy financial ledger balanced on her knees, while Bertha leaned entirely against her side. They were laughing quietly over a picture Bertha was drawing in the margins of a notepad. For years, Bertha had lived a ghost-like existence, isolated behind bulletproof glass and heavily armed guards, stripped of a normal childhood after her mother passed. Watching them, Jimmy felt a strange, unfamiliar thaw prick at his chest. The stark, defensive walls his daughter had built since the shooting were completely gone, replaced by a genuine warmth that his millions could never buy. Later that night, long after Bertha had been tucked into bed, the office returned to its quiet, amber-lit solitude. Jimmy poured 2 heavy measures of neat bourbon, sliding one across the mahogany desk toward Veronica. The heavy silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was the quiet of 2 survivors acknowledging each other's scars. Jimmy took a slow sip, his gaze drifting to the city lights bleeding through the blinds. "People think a crown like this makes you untouchable," he murmured, his voice laced with a rare, gravelly vulnerability. "But it just means you're everyone's target. Every dollar earned is a threat to my daughter's life. I sleep with one eye open, wondering if the next hand I shake is holding a blade." Veronica stared at the dark amber liquid in her glass, her fingers tracing the rim. "I never wanted to know your world, Jimmy," she admitted softly, the shadow of fear returning to her eyes. "I was just doing my job as a senior forensic auditor. I flagged a series of anomalous wire transfers for a multinational shipping client. I didn't know the accounts belonged to a cartel shell company until my apartment was ransacked and my colleague disappeared. I ran because knowing the truth became a death sentence." Jimmy looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the fierce resilience beneath her trembling exterior. For the first time, she wasn't just a blood debt he had to pay, she was one of them. The bass from the main floor pulsed violently through the floorboards of the Onyx Lounge, a rhythmic thumping that matched the anxious drumming of Veronica's pulse. The club was alive with the glitterati of Los Angeles, a packed VIP event where flashing strobe lights masked the dangerous undercurrents of the city. Watching from the elevated mezzanine, Veronica kept her eyes sharp, monitoring the floor and cross-referencing the high-profile guest list. Then, the air in her lungs turned to ice. Standing near the perimeter of the primary bar, half hidden by a marble pillar, was a face pulled straight from her nightmares. It was a known cartel scout, a cold-eyed spotter she recognized from her desperate days of tracking her pursuers. He wasn't drinking, and he wasn't looking at the dancers. His eyes were scanning the exits, calculating the security blind spots, and fixing intently on the corridor leading up to Jimmy's private quarters. Panic flared hot in Veronica's chest, urging her to run, to pack her bags and slip out the back. Instead, she took a breath and chose to fight. Slipping through the crowd, she approached Marco at the VIP entrance, her voice a calm, steady whisper against his ear. She gave him the exact coordinates, the jacket color, and the lethal identity of the man by the pillar. Marco didn't hesitate. With a subtle nod to 2 nearby enforcers, a silent, coordinated dragnet closed in. Before the scout could even reach into his pocket, 2 massive hands clamped onto his shoulders. They moved him smoothly through the heavy velvet curtains and out toward the soundproofed back alley, completely invisible to the wealthy patrons drinking champagne just feet away. The threat was neutralized in absolute silence, leaving the music playing and Veronica standing tall, a guardian of the house. The elevator descended deep into the subterranean concrete beneath the club, leaving the muffled vibration of the music far behind. When the reinforced steel doors slid open, the air turned cool, thick with the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil and burnt gunpowder. Jimmy stepped out into his private firing range, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead glinting off his tailored pinstripes and the intricate ink creeping up his neck. Veronica followed closely, her heart hammering against her ribs as Jimmy unlatched a heavy tactical case resting on the counter. Inside lay a sleek, matte black semi-automatic pistol. The cartel scout was a warning shot, Jimmy said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with a grim, unyielding finality. They know you're in the city. Marco and his men can hold the line, but if a breach happens, you cannot be a liability. You need to be able to protect Bertha. You need to be able to protect yourself. He didn't just hand her the weapon. He stepped behind her, his large, tattooed hands guiding her trembling fingers onto the grip. The proximity was a rare display of intimacy for a man who kept the world at arm's length. He adjusted her posture, locking her elbows and aligning her shoulders. "Feel the weight of it," he murmured near her ear. "Don't fight the recoil. Own it." Veronica took a ragged breath, squeezing her eyes shut for a fraction of a second before locking them onto the paper silhouette target 50 feet down the lane. The cold steel in her hand felt heavy, terrifying, and intoxicatingly empowering. She was no longer just the forensic auditor who ran from shadows. She was standing in the inner sanctum of the Falcone Empire, learning the language of its survival. Now, squeeze. Slowly. The gunshot shattered the silence of the bunker, a deafening crack that reverberated through her bones. The recoil bit into her palms, but her stance held firm. Down the range, a clean hole punched through the center mass of the paper target. Jimmy stepped back, a rare, ghost of a smile touching his lips as he looked at the smoking barrel. In that quiet underworld beneath the city, no words were needed. By teaching her to deal death, the mafia boss had given her life, and formally welcomed her into his dangerous world. The silver tray sat on the mahogany desk, catching the amber glow of the desk lamps. In its center rested a small, blood-stained velvet box. Marco stood rigid by the door, his face unusually pale as Jimmy flipped the lid open with the tip of his fountain pen. Inside lay a severed finger, still wearing a heavy gold signet ring belonging to one of Jimmy's peripheral street contacts. Pinned beneath it was a single sheet of heavy parchment, written in a stark, elegant cursive. "The woman by midnight, Falcone. Or we burn Los Angeles to the ground with you inside it." The silence in the office turned suffocating. Jimmy stared at the gruesome ultimatum, his eyes wide and unblinking, his tattooed jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. Veronica stood a few feet away, her eyes locked onto the box, the breath catching in her throat as the cold realization washed over her. The cartel had found her, and they were willing to wage a full-scale underworld war to drag her back into the dark. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him she would leave, to beg him not to risk his empire or his daughter for her. Jimmy didn't give her the chance. With a chilling, methodical calm, he pulled a silver Zippo lighter from his pocket. The wheel sparked, and a flame danced in the quiet room. Jimmy snagged the blood-spotted note with his fingers, held the corner to the fire, and watched the threat catch. He dropped the burning paper into his crystal ashtray, watching the cartel's grand ultimatum turn to worthless ash. He looked up, his wide, dark eyes locking onto Veronica with absolute finality. "A Falcone never breaks his word," Jimmy growled. "Marco, lock down the grid. Let them try." The grandfather clock in the corner of the office struck midnight, its heavy chimes completely swallowed by a sudden, deafening explosion from the ground floor. The reinforced structure of the Onyx Lounge shuddered violently as the front entrance blew inward, sending a deadly storm of pulverized marble and shattered glass raining into the dark foyer. High-pitched security alarms instantly cut through the silence, their crimson strobe lights painting the pristine white walls in a frantic, bloody rhythm. The cartel had arrived. Within seconds, the sound of automatic gunfire erupted below, a breathless, tearing rhythm that echoed up the grand stairwell. Heavy boots stomped through the smoke as a coordinated hit squad flooded the building, tactical flashlights cutting through the haze. Marco and his enforcers immediately fired back from behind the marble pillars, their pistols barking in a desperate attempt to hold the bottleneck, but the sheer volume of the cartel's heavy weapons pinned them flat against the stone. Upstairs in the private office, Jimmy slammed a fresh magazine into his matte black pistol, his wide eyes flashing with a predatory rage. He dragged a heavy leather armchair across the doorway, creating a makeshift barricade as plaster and splinters flew from the walls under the incoming barrage. Dust rained down from the ceiling, choking the air as the shockwaves of the assault drew closer. Veronica was huddled near the back desk, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands, though trembling, gripped the weapon Jimmy had taught her to use. The safe haven had become a war zone, the suffocating smoke rolling into the room as the cartel pushed relentlessly toward the inner sanctum. Drywall disintegrated into white powder as a fresh volley of automatic fire chewed through the office walls. Down the hallway, Marco and the remaining Falcone enforcers bled for every inch of marble, their pistols roaring back through the choking cordite smoke to block the stairs. They were heavily outgunned, but they fought with the savage desperation of men protecting their home. Jimmy peered through the splintered gaps of the door barricade, his tactical instincts taking over the moment the cartel's gunfire paused to reload. With a low growl, he vaulted over the desk, using the intersecting blind spots of the burning corridor to slip into the adjacent VIP lounge, flanking the attackers from the shadows. Inside the inner office, the air was thick and suffocating. Veronica pressed her back against the heavy mahogany desk, her fingers wrapped tight around the matte black pistol. Bertha was tucked directly beneath her arm, trembling violently and burying her face into Veronica's dark coat. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door frame splintered completely. A lone cartel hitman, masked in black and carrying a tactical shotgun, kicked through the makeshift barricade. The crimson security strobes caught the gleam of his barrel as he swept the room, his eyes locking instantly onto the little girl. Time slowed to a crawl. The cold weight of the steel in Veronica's hands no longer felt terrifying. It felt necessary. Don't fight the recoil. Own it. Jimmy's voice echoed in her mind, overriding the paralysis of her fear. Veronica stood up, locking her elbows and aligning her shoulders exactly as she had been taught in the concrete bunker beneath the city. Before the hitman could level his weapon, she squeezed the trigger. The deafening crack of her pistol shattered the room. The first round punched straight into the gunman's shoulder, throwing off his aim as his shotgun blasted harmlessly into the ceiling. Without hesitating, Veronica squeezed again, the heavy recoil biting into her palms as a second shot dropped him heavily into the doorway. From the hallway, the sudden roar of Jimmy's weapon signaled the end of the assault as he cleared the remaining executioners from behind. He broke back into the office, his chest heaving, his tailored suit torn and stained with soot. He stopped dead, his wide, predatory eyes sweeping from the fallen hitman to Veronica, who stood tall, her smoking barrel lowered, still shielding his daughter. The frantic wail of the security alarms finally died, replaced by the quiet, steady hum of the city breathing outside the reinforced windows. Weeks had passed since that blood-drenched midnight, and the Falcone Empire had moved with terrifying, surgical precision to erase every remaining cartel cell from the Los Angeles grid. The message had been delivered in a language the underworld understood perfectly. Veronica was untouchable, and the price for crossing the Falcone family was total annihilation. The scent of gunpowder and burnt drywall was entirely gone, replaced by the rich aroma of seared steak and expensive wine. The office had been flawlessly restored, its marble walls repaired and the mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine. Jimmy hosted a quiet, private dinner within the inner sanctum, the atmosphere warm and thick with a profound sense of shared survival. Bertha sat at the table, her laughter no longer guarded, her small hand resting affectionately over Veronica's forearm. Jimmy stood up, pulling a crystal decanter toward him. He poured 2 heavy measures of neat bourbon, sliding one across the polished wood to Veronica. His wide, dark eyes, once filled with absolute paranoia, shone with a deep, unyielding respect. "To family," Jimmy said, his gravelly voice echoing softly in the quiet room. "The ones who choose to stand by you when the world burns." He reached into his tailored vest pocket and placed a small, velvet-lined box on the desk. Inside lay a heavy, gleaming gold ring etched with the sharp lines of the Falcone family crest. It was a symbol of absolute protection, a token that meant she would never have to run again. Veronica slid the ring onto her finger, the cold metal anchoring her to her new home. Thank you for watching. See you on the next story.